Good evening, everybody, in person and online. It's really wonderful to have all of you. My name is Dr. Michael Morelli. I'm Assistant Professor of Theology and Ethics at Northwest and Acts Seminary. And on behalf of Northwest, Acts, and Trinity Western University, we're so glad you're here, both in person and online. I'll be introducing our presenter and respondent for this evening. And for those of you who are new to our In the Chair Pickford Symposia, what we do is a pretty classic format. We have the topic, you know the topic, that's why you're here. And our presenter tonight, Dr. Archie Spencer, the Pickford Chair, the one that we know and love, will be presenting on just war for a period of time. And then Dr. Grant Havers will be giving a short response. Archie will respond to his response briefly, and then we'll have a time for Q&A with our panel. And for those of you who are online, we encourage you to send in your questions. I have my computer at the table here so I can curate those questions and ask them on your behalf so that we don't have to play that awkward unmute your mic, get your camera on the screen and that sort of thing. And for those in person, if you want to ask your questions, just raise your hand and I'll call on you, stand up, deliver your question. We don't need to pass around a mic. This mic will pick up your voice and we will have a rich discussion, I imagine, about a very timely topic. Amen. So to introduce our presenter for this evening, Dr. Archie Spencer, he's developed an international reputation as a scholar, speaker, and theologian, including Catholic circles, where he's developed an ecumenical dialogue with the lay movement Communion and Liberation and the Italian theologian Luigi Giussani. He has authored The Analogy of Faith, The Quest for God's Speakability, and Clearing a Space for Human Action, Ethical Ontology in the Early Theology of Karl Barth. Archie's ministry and professional experience includes serving as a pastor in various settings within the Pentecostal and Baptist context for over 15 years. While teaching, he has continued to remain active in the local church through various preaching engagements, seminars, and retreats. He loves engaging the church as he thinks through his theological and missional mandate and packing in fishing once in a while to boot. And to my right here, we have Dr. Grant Havers, our respondent for this evening. He's the chair of the Department of Philosophy with a cross-appointment in the Department of Political Studies at Trinity Western University. In addition to teaching philosophy and political studies at an undergraduate level, Havers was a recipient of the David Distinguished Teaching Award in 2004. His field of expertise is political philosophy, with particular emphasis on modern political philosophy. He's the author of 2 books, Leo Strauss and the Anglo-American Democracy, A Conservative Critique, and Lincoln and the New Politics of Christian Love. The main focus of his research is to investigate and articulate the biblical foundations of modern political philosophy. So already you are getting a scene set for our discussion tonight. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Spencer.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we'll have a fair bit of material to get through tonight. It will be longer than I normally go for this paper, but I really feel that what I have to say is of such critical importance that I want to have the time to say it in an important way. The concept of just war as a theological problem has been a topic of debate since the 5th century. It is a theoretical, in its theoretical form, it can be multifaceted and is usually relegated to the general category of political theology and its related principles of theological ethics and church-state relations. It also has counterparts that draw from the theological description in the fields of secular political theory and philosophy in general. So we'll limit our discussion to the theological description of the problem, though it cannot always be completely separated out from its political and philosophical dimensions. Since Aquinas, it has been fervently discussed in the midst of military conflict, its impending possibility or its immediate aftermath, either to aid in political theological decision-making or in terms of any post-war settlements in the direction of peace and justice. In this paper, I want to explore the theological concept of just war in the context of technologically advanced modern warfare and the possibility of establishing criteria for just war in the light of such advancement. In short, I want to ask the question, Can a just war be fought under the conditions of modern warfare with its capacity for mutually assured destruction? This is quite a different question than the pre-20th century theological understanding of just war in general. It is one that supersedes the older form as, I think, the real concern to be determined in the current context. To get a clear answer to our question in the present situation, we will first delineate the theological conditions for just war that have been traditionally laid out in the theologies of Augustine and Aquinas. These theologians have been the most consistently referred to in just war theology prior to the 20th century, and they have set the broad terms of the debate. Our goal in this part of our exposition is to simply lay out the categories that they have put forward as constituting just cause for war. Following that, we'll seek to explore the just war theory of the one theologian of the 20th century whose major work was carried out during the two greatest conflicts the world has ever known. Between the years 1911, when Karl Barth assumed the pulpit as a pastor at Safenville, Switzerland, and his beginning tenure as professor of theology in Basel in 1945 until 1968. He actually began in 35, but worked through the war years. Barth will have already conducted what one scholar calls a Copernican revolution in theology. He managed to do this despite the severe wartime conditions in which he worked for most of that time. It is possible to say that Barth's theology represents a resolute proclamation of the Christian message in the face of a culture of war. But something unique in just war theology happens along the way in Barth's journey, especially as it relates to the technological developments in the capacity for nuclear war. Barth's hesitation here was an important signal that needs to be taken into account in the current situation with respect to the possibility or impossibility of that theological justification. At the close of this paper, brief reference to the current conflict will then be offered in terms of the Russian-Ukrainian-Western, Ukrainian/Western competing claims to be the combatants who occupy the high moral ground with regard to just cause for the war that they are conducting. We take up the case for just war here in order to briefly analyze their claims in the light of the possibility of any justification of war under the conditions of mutually assured destruction, popularly known as MAD, that Barth found to be a mitigating factor in all attempts to justify war after the advent of World War II. Our point here will not be to take sides, but to illustrate why the status of just war might not be available to either party, especially as it is now being invoked by some Western NATO states. This paper is not about who is right and wrong in that current conflict, but whether justice can prevail at all through the employment of war, given what is at stake for the rest of humanity. Even though the paper is oriented on the theological question, it certainly does have implications for the political and philosophical disciplines and how they should answer this question as well. That's why I'm really thankful to have Dr. Havers here to weigh in on the question, though I'm sure he'll also have interest in the theological side as well. So first, just war in Augustine and Aquinas, beginning with Augustine. The modern concept of just war is rooted in the Christian tradition. It is based on the idea that war can be justified if it is fought for a just cause on the one hand and conducted in a just manner on the other. The initial theologian in the development of the concept was, of course, as I've said, St. Augustine. He was perhaps the first to argue that war could be justified, but within the strict moral parameters that he lays out. However, he also made it clear that war can only be fought as a last resort. Furthermore, such a war must be fought with restraint and mercy and with a view to minimizing civilian casualties and the destruction of property. He was clearly on the side of understanding that war was an absolute evil in its essence, as his response to Faustus the Manichaean makes clear. Let me read briefly. What is the evil of war, says Augustine? The real evils in war are love of violence, revengeful cruelty, fierce and implacable enmity, wild resistance, and the lust for power and the like. And good men undertake wars when they find themselves in such a position as regards the conduct of human affairs that right conduct requires them to act or to make others act in this way, that is the way of war. In this passage, Augustine is wanting to clearly affirm that he sees nothing redeeming in war in and of itself. It is an altogether negative means of destroying, controlling, or rectifying negative conditions through identical means. That war has to be fought to bring an end to evil conditions is, in a sense, the perpetuation of the evil it seeks to end. Says Augustine, a great deal depends on the causes for which men undertake wars and on the authority they have for doing so. For the natural order which seeks the peace of mankind ordains that the monarch should have power of undertaking war if he thinks it advisable, and that the soldiers should perform their military duties on behalf of the peace and safety of the community. When war is undertaken in obedience to God, he says, who would rebuke the humble or crush the pride of man, it then must be allowed to be a just war. Augustine seems to think that as an aspect of natural law to which the Old Testament clearly pointed, it is a principle of social justice that God ordained should be part of the political order of creation. While the New Testament does seem to contradict the whole idea of just war, at least according to Faustus the Manichaean, Augustine saw the argument from more of a canonical point of view in which the Old Testament had to be accounted for. He saw in Moses, for instance, the embodiment of this social political order and interpreted the divinely sanctioned wars in the Old Testament as, quote, just and righteous retribution, unquote, designed to restrain evil and thus good for the whole, despite those who are caused to suffer. Such wars were to be without libido, he says, on the part of participants who would, under those conditions, be absolved from participation in such horrors. Augustine's theology of just war can be reduced to three basic principles. These include, first, that war can only be justified in the cause of, or in the case of a just cause, of avenging injuries. Secondly, it can only be conducted on the part of legitimate governing authorities. Thirdly, it must proceed according to the righteous intention of the just cause. But it was to be resorted to only as a last recourse in Augustine, and with all due diplomatic patience in respect to the fact that there may be, in some circumstances, equal justification on both sides for war. It also follows that the war must have reasonable expectations of success. As Frederick Russell puts it, for Augustine, the burden of proof lay upon those who wished to go to war, close quote. It was for this reason that he wanted to reflect on the question within the bounds of the moral order of the universe that both the Incarnation and Scriptures witness to, and not just on the basis of the idea of government as an order of creation alone. The Augustinian perspective was to wait nearly 1,000 years to get any further development, which it does get from Thomas Aquinas, to whom we now turn. In terms very similar to the identification of just cause as the rectification of injury and injustice seen in Augustine, Thomas Aquinas also argued that war should be fought only if it is necessary to protect the innocent and to restore justice. He also agreed with Augustine that war should be fought with restraint and mercy, and that it should be conducted in a way that minimizes civilian casualties and property destruction. For Aquinas, war can only be justified between states on the following conditions. First, as with Augustine, it must be invoked by a sovereign authority who represents the whole state. Secondly, it must be conducted only if there is a just cause, such as protection of the innocent. Thirdly, the belligerents must have morally right intentions. That is to say, and Aquinas is quite clear on this, vengeance, expansion of empire, or profit material territorial gains are disallowed as motivations for war, and as such cannot constitute just war. But these morally right intentions come with qualifications. These come out of his discussion in questions 7 and 64 of part 2 of the Summa Theologiae that have to do with justified killing in self-defense and its double effect, namely that there's always a good and a negative evil effect in killing. We will there should always be a good motive, but always a negative effect attends it. That's his understanding of double effect. We will take just a few moments here now to highlight certain aspects of Aquinas' position that will be relevant to our treatment of Barth later on. Just as with Augustine, for Aquinas, just war cannot be invoked by individuals or factions within the state. So he doesn't allow for civil war, for instance. This means that there are certain qualifying features that the state must attend to in declaring a war. Such wars are just only when they are, as Aquinas says, in defense of the common good. Thus, it is the task of the sovereign, who has the care for the national common good, to decide only after careful consideration what that good consists in. It is not in the interest of the common good, for example, when the conduct of a war in the conduct of a war, it is contrary to the unity of the multitude, which is a manifest good. In this respect, opposition to a tyrant can be permissible. It is possible in the conduct of war that a tyrannical government is not just because it is directed not to the common good, but to the private good of the ruler. In that case, resistance to the tyrant is permissible, if indeed the tyrant's rule disturbs the nation so inordinately that his subjects suffer greater harm from the consequent disturbance of his rule than they do from his removal, such that it's disproportionate to the common good. In respect to just cause, therefore, Aquinas lays out several causes which concern the state in its conduct of war. A just cause could exist if an enemy state is attacked because they simply deserve it, as Aquinas says, by virtue of some fault that they have created. Or a state may war justly to avenge a wrong, or to punish an enemy for refusing to make amends for some past fault. Or finally, it may be fought so as to restore what was seized unjustly. Later political philosophers expanded on Aquinas' list of just causes to include the idea that some state might have just cause if someone other than the allied warring state suffered from an enemy's unjust aggression. This means a war could be justified for a third party when that state justly wars on another state to defend a third state. Finally, for Aquinas, a state and its combatants must have right intentions as participants in just war. This includes good reasons of advancement of the good and the avoidance of evil. Unjust reasons include things like greed, cruelty, expansion of empire, and personal vengeance. Well, so much for Augustine and Aquinas setting the basic parameters. I'd like you to think of this as the pre-20th century concept of just war. The positions described above have been historically the standard conception of just war, jus ad bellum in the Latin, up to and including the early modern period. This situation remained unchanged right up to and near the end of World War II. But with the emergence of the capacity of humanity to destroy itself through nuclear weaponry and other technological developments, the argument for just war took a decidedly negative direction against such. This can be illustrated most clearly in the development of Karl Barth's thinking continuing up to and through the late stages of World War II. Even in respect to the German theological justification for war in WW1, and certainly in respect to the National Socialist aggression of the German state in 1939 and following, Barth was already trying to straddle the difficult and dialectical fulcrum between just war on the one hand and absolute pacifism on the other. While some Barth scholars attribute this to Barth's dialectical method and or the complexities of his experiences in his Swiss national identity, it can also be related to his observations with respect to the technological capacity for war and its rapid acceleration towards the possibility of a war of mutual self-destruction. Taken as a historically determined development on Barth's part, it leaves him finally in a position more suited to pacifism than on the side of just war. There are three main areas where Barth's writings that illustrate this observational trajectory in his thought. It seems to the present reader that the reason for his final subtle and inconclusive shift in Barth's thinking has to do with the shock and dismay at the developments within nuclear warfare. Hiroshima, and he comments on this in several places, was without doubt the defining moment in his shift to a more pacifist stance. Beginning with the first full treatment of the theme in the lectures on ethics offered at the University of Bonn in 1928 to 30, to the development of his just war theology under the ethics of creation in Church Dogmatics 3:4, to finally his apparent partial authorship of a series of 10 theses presented to the Synod of the German Evangelical Church in 1958, written on behalf of the so-called Church Brotherhood. This last document represents Barth's most mature thinking on just war and illustrates well the impossibility Barth perceives in any justification for modern warfare, given its technological capacity for mutually assured destruction. Let's take each of these three main treatments chronologically from a genetic historical point of view so as to demonstrate the trajectory of Barth's arrival at that position. It'll be instructive for us in our own current context. We will then be in a position to argue that, in the current context, Barth's implicit denial of any justification for war in the modern sense might be instructive for us today. I will argue that Barth's position needs further exploration and development in the same direction so that the Church might know where it must stand in any Western justification for war against Russia, which now seems to be a distinct possibility. It is a well-known fact in Barth scholarship that the most profound shift in his thinking takes place not within the fabric of the church dogmatics per se, but within the historical context of the German decision to go to war in November of 1914. It was during this time that Barth's theological world was shaken to its core when he discovered that the majority of his liberal Protestant teachers had signed on to the document issued by the German Kaiser in support of war in 1914. It was then, says Barth, that his teachers, quote, showed themselves to be hopelessly compromised by their submission to the ideology of war, close quote. For Barth, such a move was in its essence antithetical to everything he had been taught by them about scripture, theology, and ethics. Again, salient, quote, Barth says, an entire world of theological exegesis, ethics, dogmatics, and preaching, which up to that point I had accepted as basically credible, was thereby shaken to the foundations, and with it everything which flowed at that time from the pens of the German theologians, quote, close quote. Indeed, as Bruce McCormick makes abundantly clear, this break is already an indication of Barth's strident anti-war sentiment. While Barth seems to hold some place for just war, even late in the dogmatics, neither in the Romans Commentary 1 or the Romans Commentary 2 can it ever be theologically justified in relation to the Sixth Commandment. Barth views it as antithetical to Christian ethics as such. As he himself says in the Roma Brief 2 commentary, quote, what more radical action can the revolutionary perform than the action of turning back to the original root of not doing, of not being angry, of not engaging in an assault, of not demolishing? This is a sentiment that will remain with him throughout his career and that will intensify in a direct correlation to the increasing destructive possibilities of modern warfare. Indeed, this original anti-war sentiment emerges quite forcefully in the first full-dress treatment of the theme in the Ethics of 1929-30. Therein, he treats it as an ethical concern for the preservation of life, stated in the negative, thou shalt not kill. But he places the primary interpretation of the command of life and its execution not in the human willing and doing, but in divine willing and doing. It is God who gives us the command to live by, and he supplies us with the life we live. It is his solely to give or to take and to rescind as a commandment. And quote, "For in this regard, God, as the Lord of life, can at any moment, with the same creative power and wisdom, cause us to live or die. Here also, to be ready for both is what is always required in obedience to the command to live." From the start, Barth is concerned that it not be misunderstood as an independent will to live, rooted, he thinks, in a will to power for the sake of preserving our own life at the expense of others. It is all too easy, he thinks, for modern humanity to justify taking life simply in the interest of preserving the life of someone else. All attempts at the justification of killing, be it self-defense, suicide, euthanasia, capital punishment, or war, cannot find a natural defense in the light of the biblical commandment to preserve life. Asserting our creaturely life takes place under the demands and restrictions that are not primarily under our own control. At this point, Barth launches into an extensive discussion of the Nietzschean conception of the will to power that he suspects is often at the root of some attempts to justify war on behalf of the state. We act and live as we can and will, whether individually or nationally, because it is the exercise of our will to power so that we might live over against all else. It is this element that Barth thinks has often been unaccounted for in our desire to justify the taking of life, and it is precisely the element that might very well vitiate any justification for war. Even Nietzsche understood that our life act is never individually moral. One's life act is neither good nor bad in and of itself, but, as Barth says, it reveals itself to be good or bad in the event of our encounter with God's command, so that it is with the will to power which is always implicated in the life act. In juxtaposing the will to power with the command of life in this way, Barth is already admitting something very problematic about the whole enterprise called just war theology. Nietzsche himself did not see in the principle of the will to power a condition necessitating the assertion of one's individual life over against another, but rather the will for form, that is the aristia or beauty of life that he often talked about. That this conception was co-opted as the philosophical grounds for war at any time was the result of a bad reading of his philosophy by French war propaganda, pointing to him as the prophet of war, or the prophet of force, they sometimes called it, that infected the German war mentality. In fact, says Barth, the real power of life does not have to be bound up with our triumph or victory in war. The criterion of the true will to power in individuals and states might be whether a man is able to live with the breaking of his will to power, whether the breaking of the will means disaster for his life. That is, whether the lion can just as well be the lamb. This, he says, is the power and the possibility of Jesus Christ, who is one in order to be the other. He is, as such, the center of the crisis of our own will to power. In that respect, the command of God the Creator is also the command of Jesus Christ, Revelations 5:5. In the command of life, quote, it can be a two-sided order for us, and obedience to it means openness to all the possibilities that are included in the supremacy of God's power over ours. Thus, it is in the ethics, with this as the basis of his understanding of the command to life, that Barth adopts a conception of just war that is considerably chastened by the divine power over life, and therefore severely limits what Christian ethics might permit to justify such a war. Barth couches his understanding of just war in the ethics within the same nexus of the dialectic between the will to power and the divine command to respect life. Any argument for the former without reference to the latter is almost always simply an argument to will the life of the state over the life of another, purely for the preservation of the national cultural identity that will likely be, besides the point anyway, in the command to preserve life. In that respect, war stands in the closest possible connection to the death penalty, except now as a state task. On that level, he sees the whole difference between the death penalty and war, that is, as a pure act of the will. War is an execution which a people organize as a state on account of its will to live, and then performs on another people which threatens its will to live. The problem of war, then, is whether such an execution is possible in spite of the respect for life. In Barth's mind, if this is the just reason on the basis of which one argues to go to war, then all he can say is that it represents the will to power without the necessary reference to the will for life. He draws a conclusion here that he constantly carries forward in his dogmatics under the command of God the Creator. He writes, "As I accept war on any justified basis, I again accept killing in defense. It is either I or he. The only difference is that now I do so as a member, but as a responsible member of my people. It may be that I must do it. Ethics cannot forbid war, but it cannot really command it either. It can only point to the Creator's command of life, of respect for life, and say imperturbably that in peace and war, we humans are measured by this command. This is God's command, whose concrete content we do not control. It may be then that we today may also have to will and make war in obedience to this command. But, and here Barth's equivocation is core to his understanding that war is not as such theologically defensible. It may also be, he says, that as we listen more closely to what is demanded of us, reason will be taken out of the ultimate reason, and the resultant slogan will be, "Down with all arguments." Barth has more to say on this issue in the Ethics, but this should suffice us to now to indicate the general ground of his argument that he carries forward in subsequent development of his theology. Here we need only note that from the very first moments of his anti-war sentiment, Barth sees the concept of just war as theologically indefensible in the light of the command to life. This does not mean, paradoxically, that he disavows or disallows just war in a general sense, but it is clear that the concept of just war in and of itself is antithetical to Christian ethics, and therefore can have no theological grounds as such. So now let's turn to CD 3.4. This equivocation intensifies in the church dogmatics, especially in his most substantial treatment of the problem of war in CD 3.4. This negative position is further intensified, as also intensified in his treatment of the Christian life under the concept of discipleship in CD 4.2, wherein he calls for a practical pacifism on the part of all Christians, even if we cannot adopt the position of absolute pacifism. In CD 3.4, however, Barth is treating the problem of war under the same categories he did in the Ethics, namely as it relates to the sixth commandment against the taking of life, and only under the positive designation similar in terms to the command of life. Here, however, he terms it respect for life. In fact, some of the material in the Ethics is transported directly into the dogmatics, albeit with considerable alterations. As in his Ethics, Barth considers all citizens to be involved when the state conducts war, and that this constitutes the primary difference between pre-modern conceptions of just war and the conditions under which the state must now conduct war, which involves the citizens as co-belligerents with the state, due to the fact that modern technology has made it such that civilians are always implicated. Quote, "Today, everyone is a military person, either directly or indirectly. That is to say, everyone participates in the suffering and action which war demands. All states as such, and all their members, have long since become responsible military subjects." Barth thinks that the character of war has always been conducted with interests that are, more often than not, aside from any morally righteous cause or noble intention, but that waging war primarily has to do with material interest, and that war is about killing as many of the enemy as possible. And that's a quote. He sees it as perhaps hopeful that we have been forced to face the reality of war without any optimistic illusions. He thinks that the negativity of war is a positive inducement not to do it. And he thinks this is certainly the most common cause in the case for war in the modern era. That is, that it's greed rather than justice. While the possibility of a just war might in certain circumstances be commanded by God, nevertheless, the church's most strident position must start with the assumption that the inflexible negative of pacifism has almost infinite arguments in its favor and is almost overpoweringly strong. In fact, he says, while it is possible that we can stay with the pacifist position longer than we should have in some cases, nevertheless, it is better than making the mistake of not staying with the position as long as we could have. Furthermore, he says, it has always been realized that the main goal of war is to neutralize the forces of the enemy. But it has not always been seen so clearly as one might desire that this goal demands not merely the most skillful and courageous dedication and possible forfeiture of one's own life, but also nakedly and brutally the killing of as many as possible of the men who make up the opposing forces, close quote. The reason for this is that the modern warfare has reshaped the battlefield in such a way that this is nominal reason for war, that this nominal reason for war no longer exists, since co-belligerents can often not see who they are killing. This is the result, says Barth, of modern capacity to conduct war. Today, the increasing scientific objectivity of military killing, the development, appalling effectiveness, and dreadful nature of the methods, instruments, and machines employed, and the extension of the conflict to the civilian population have made it quite clear that war does in fact mean no more and no less than killing, with neither glory, dignity, or chivalry, with neither restraint or consideration in any respect. It is this fact, and with this development of the capacity for mutual self-destruction, that has changed the face of warfare such that it cannot be justified from a Christian ethical standpoint of view for any reason. So, Barth concludes, much is already gained if only we do at least soberly admit that, whatever may be the purpose or possible justice of war, it now means that without disguise or shame, not only individuals or even armies, but whole states as such, are out to destroy one another by every possible means. It only needed the atom and the hydrogen bomb to complete the self-disclosure of war in this regard. It is this concern that drives his opposition to traditional forms of the justification for war, whether it has to do with the right of the state by virtue of the order of creation, or in the face of some perceived injustice perpetuated on one state by another, even if initially a righteous conduct of war is intended and all the rules for the protection of civilian life and infrastructure are initially ensured, the slippery slope to the use of nuclear weapons makes the justification of war virtually impossible. For that very reason, says Barth, all affirmative answers to this question are wrong from the very outset, and the Christian ethics constitute a flat betrayal of the gospel if they ignore the whole risk and venture of this nevertheless. Some have mistaken this statement as a conditional support for the absolute pacifist position, but as already mentioned, in fact, this is not the case. Barth sees both the pacifist position and the case for just war as an extreme position that in and of themselves may lead either to an unstable and inauthentic peace, or on the one hand, or a carte blanche justification for war on the other. This is demonstrated in the history of the defense of just war itself, especially in its Augustinian mode. However, in Barth's understanding, the context of modern warfare, this axiomatic position cannot serve Christianity in its ethical decisions in support of war in a modern age. Barth's conclusion is that Christianity cannot be able to speak peace into a situation in dire need of it if it follows the just war argument. So he says, even if the message of the church cannot be a simple one of pacifism, it should surely have been a light in the dark world, at least to the extent of arousing and keeping alert a sense of the enormity of war, at any rate amongst its own members, and even beyond, and thus of constituting and imposing a strong restraining factor in this fact. How can it be, for all its weaknesses, a small yet significant force for peace, he's talking about the church, when it is obviously no longer horrified by war, but willing and able to integrate it quite smoothly into its system of political life, recognizing it, and then into its own Christian theological system? Barth's answer is that rather than a case for just war on the one hand or absolute pacifism on the other, war should not be recognized as normal, fixed, and in some sense a necessary part of what constitutes the just state or the political order commanded by God. It is rather an opus alienum, an alien work, rather than an opus proprium, a proper work. Certainly, he says, the state as such possesses the power and must be able to exercise it. But it does this in any case, and it is so primarily concerned with Christian ethics to say it should do so, or to maintain that the exercise of war powers constitutes the essence of the state, its opus proprium, or even a part of it. Rather, says Barth, what Christian ethics must insist is that this opus alienum, this alien work of the state, for this alien work of the state to have to exercise its power. It cannot assure the state that in the exercise of such power, either the state or its organs may go gaily and confidently about the task, whatever they think is right. In such cases, Christian ethics must always confront them with the question whether there really is any necessity for the exercise of war. That is to say, of all the entities who might rush to the moral support for war, the Christian faith must hold back to the last possible degree with the last possible defense of the pacifist position. Pacifism, while not adequate in all circumstances calling the state to war, must nevertheless be the Christian's impulse. The church and theology must have supremely to make this detached and delayed movement. If they do not first and for a long time make this the burden of their message, they have become savorless salt and must not be surprised when they are freely thrown out and trampled underfoot. Indeed, if the church treats war as the opus proprium of the state, then it is then in the darkest hour and at the last moment of its possibility to speak against it, they will be in no position to say authentically and authoritatively what they may say at such a time. This was the position that liberal Protestantism found itself in 1914 and 38, precisely on the eves of World War I and II, respectively. Barth cites in order his teacher, William Herman, in the case of his support for war in 1914, and a fellow colleague, Paul Althaus, in his support for war in 1938, both of whom justified war on the basis of the cultural and historical privilege of the German state. Indeed, no recourse to the right to wage war on the basis of any living laws of history or cultural history or international laws of conflict can serve any state as a reason for just war. Barth concludes, it was in accordance with this kind of theological wisdom that in belief in living history, in the law of conflict, and in the determining of right by might, that new historical acts were ventured in 1938 and the Second World War began. The real defect in this position was in the fact that the church's utter oblivion and lack of consciousness with regard to the pacifist thesis, and therefore their refusal to face up to the Sixth Commandment and the naked horror of war. Their real defect is their failure to consider the first abomination of war. To be sure, the absolute pacifist position is mistaken as well in its abstract negation of war. The problem of war is that such a stance is reactive rather than proactive and forces upon the Christian a principle of disobedience in respect to its proper and divinely commanded relationship to the state. True pacifism, then, would see to it that these conditions for a proper peace are established in the state as a maximum deterrent against war. So again, citing Barth, hence the first basic and decisive point which Christian ethics must make in this matter is that the state, the totality of responsible citizens, and each individual in its own conduct should so fashion peace while there is still time that it will not lead to the explosion, but make war superfluous and unnecessary instead of inevitable. Why does Barth reject both positions, such as, since there seems to be no viable alternative in terms of a mediating position? I'm talking about militarism on the one side in just war and absolute pacifism on the other. Because, says Barth, pacifists and militarists are actually agreed in the fact that for them, the fashioning of peace as the fashioning of the state for democracy or of democracy for social democracy is a secondary concern as compared with either rearmament or disarmament, depending on which side you're on. It is for this reason that Christian ethics must oppose both. However much these extremes may seem at times necessary, depending on which one you support, neither in the last analysis have a conscience for or contribution to make to true and lasting peace, which is in fact the proper ethical stand to take in the light of the Sixth Commandment for the preservation of life. Neither rearmament nor disarmament can be a first concern, but the restoration of an order of life which is meaningful and just. Well, so much for the general conditions under which Christianity must consider its ethical stance in respect to war. What does Barth lay down as the moral conduct of war if and when the state must, in extreme circumstances or in extreme cases, go to war? Barth's conclusion seems out of place given his strident resistance to any argument in favor of war thus far in the ethics of the Christian life, or the ethics of creation, I should say. In fact, it is consistent with the two principles he laid down there that war must be considered first an alien work of the state, and secondly must be undertaken only in extreme cases. Says Barth, the church, which does not give an easy sanction to war, which constantly seeks to avert it, which is studious to avoid any general or institutional approval in principle, which proclaims peace alone as the will of God, both internally and externally, which testifies to the very last against unjust reasons for war, this church is able, in a true emergency, or in the rare case of just war, to tell men that even though they now have to kill, they are not murderers, but may and must do the will of God in this opus alienum of the state. Now, John Howard Yoder is perhaps the most salient interpreter of this section of Barth's dogmatics on this point, and he finds the conclusion here wholly out of step with everything he said beforehand. He takes Barth's positive emphasis on respect for life as somehow less than faithful to the negative aspect of the commandment, thou shalt not kill. He thinks that for Barth, the negative commandment really means thou shalt sometimes kill out of respect for life, which is a complete misreading of Barth at this point. But the criticism is not well taken if you consider Barth's dialectical form of argument that neither militarism nor pacifism is a sufficient position in terms of a theological ethics, largely because modern warfare vitiates both extremes. Barth is trying to grapple with the dialectical problem of the emerging technological capacity for mutual self-destruction and the pressing need in the light of it to speak and create the conditions for a true and lasting peace over against it. This is what he saw as the only real task of the ethical position of Christianity in the church. He sees no solace in arguments from either extreme. This comes finally into focus with his latter position on just war in the light of the capacity for mutual self-annihilation, nuclear self-annihilation, I should say. This capacity for mass destruction is made possible through modern technology and constitutes his main reason for thinking that Christian understanding of war can no longer follow the standard pre-nuclear war, just war theology, especially in its Germanic form of the argument. His final position on this, in the present writer's mind, also is the most salient and important aspect of his thought on this topic. The essence of his thinking on nuclear war can best be observed in the 10 theses he helped draft on behalf of the Kirchliche Bruderschaften, namely the Church Brotherhood. These 10 theses reveal finally why Barth struggles in such a dialectical fashion towards a theology of war. This is why Barth discusses the issues under the title, The Problem of War. They're worth our consideration here this evening, at least in some respects, because they represent the struggle in the mind of a wartime theologian who was not only acquainted with the theology of war, but was able to observe in fascinated horror both its modern capacity for mass killing and the church's inability to address such horrors with anything like a theology that truly reflected the gospel option for peace and life. The context of these 10 theses, you can call them propositions as well, and I do both here, is the East-West division of Germany and the descent of the Iron Curtain imposed on Europe by the then nuclear state of the USSR in the mid-50s. The West German government had, by 1958, formally joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and as per stipulations of that treaty, were required to rearm. This requirement threw the West German evangelical church into a state of confusion and debate. The rearmament of the remnants of the former confessing church, now known as the Church Brotherhood, which had so steadfastly opposed Hitler and the war via the Barmen Declaration, now found themselves also opposed to this rearmament. Barth was already an advisor to the Church Brotherhood, and he shared their perspective against German rearmament, especially in the light of the proximity of the Eastern Bloc states and the tensions that were beginning to rise in Germany at that time. Thereupon, in the midst of massive rearmament rallies, an appeal was made to the Synod of the Evangelical Church in Germany to refuse such a move, rearmament, on the grounds of the possibility of mutually assured destruction between the East and the West. Thus, in consultation with Barth, and with no small contribution from his own pen, 10 theses were presented as for adoption by the Synod, representing their position in relation to this move on the part of the West German government. These represent the mature form of Barth's final position on just war, even though he is not cited as the sole author. However, it is quite clear from a cursory reading of these propositions that Barth's thinking on war had now crystallized into this document. The document begins with the affirmation that while the Church has always considered just war between states a possibility for the state, now the prospects of a future war to be waged with the use of modern means of annihilation has created a new situation, and I'm citing the actual document here, in the face of which the church cannot remain neutral in respect to its ethical duty to the state, as in the past. Indeed, nuclear war means, as the fourth article affirms, quote, the mutual annihilation of the participating peoples as well as the countless human beings of other peoples which are not involved in combat between the two adversaries, close quote. Nuclear war, furthermore, makes the resolution of political conflicts impossible because of this capacity for mutual self-destruction, and as such, unjustifiable in any terms, morally or theologically. I also had politically in here and crossed it out, but I think I'll put it back in just to create some dust. Therefore, the church and the individual Christian can say nothing but an a priori no to a war with atomic weapons. Indeed, the very preparation for such a war is already a sin against God and neighbor, and thus against Christian ethical norms. The church brotherhood demanded, on the basis of that immediate end, an immediate end be made of all such preparations in West Germany, regardless of all other considerations. They then issued a challenge to their fellow German Christians that they renounce without reserve and under all circumstances any support of and participation in such a preparation for nuclear war. The 10th proposition presents well Barth's final position on the possibility of justification of war in the modern nuclear age. He says, or the document says, in the face of this question, the militant point of view or neutrality cannot be advocated Christianly. Both mean the denial of all three articles of the Christian Creed. This set of propositions garnered considerable support with at least 364 signatures of well-known German church leaders, but it was not adopted because of the ensuing debate and criticisms of the church brotherhood and Karl Barth himself, and I just don't have time to go into those, but they were quite scathing. A further meeting was set for the fall of 1958, and though Barth could not attend, he sent a considerable note of support to the church brotherhood, making it clear that his absence from the vote did not mean in any way his lack of support. So he states, "You may say to all and to everyone that I am in agreement with these theses, including the 10th, as if I had written them myself," which of course he did mostly, "and that I desire nothing more earnestly than that they should be maintained and interpreted worthily, convincingly, and joyfully, but in principle, unbendingly, in all evangelical churches in Germany." This pacifistic stance in Barth was at the time referred to as nuclear pacifism, as if to suggest that while Barth saw no place in Christianity for just conduct of nuclear war, yet somehow he held a different position in respect to conventional war. That certainly may be true to the extent of his understanding of the situation and technological developments of his time, of which he was well aware, but there is actually no indication that he thought this a valid distinction in warfare, except for his articulation of his earlier position on war in its conventional form, that is pre-nuclear form. There you go. That is before. I just wish I would just sometimes just read ahead a little bit. I'd save myself a lot of trouble. But as we have seen, Barth's position on the theological justification for war was by no means static. He held his position in terms relative to the particular context of his time. He was in every sense of the word a wartime theologian and required to adapt as he saw the need to, and would we not all have to adapt in such circumstances? His attitude in 1914, though critical of war, was nevertheless in line with much of the historic witness of the church, despite his disagreement with the Kaiser for the grounds of war at that time. This may be true of his position in relation to World War II as well, though, as we have marked there, a decidedly negative turn in his attitude towards war. What was permissible in 1914 was barely and only in extreme cases permissible in 1939 to 1944. 1945, of course, was the use of the nuclear bomb, and all justification for war was out the window. But with the advent of nuclear warfare, Barth finds that the argument for just war was wholly unsatisfactory. Yet, interestingly, he was also was any form of absolute pacifism. His dialectic may be put down not to his theological method per se, but to the impossible position which nuclear war puts Christians in respect to their ethical responsibility to the state. Where Barth would be today on the continuum is hard to say, but I would be safe to assume that the general trajectory that war was unchristian and unethical and outside the norm of its ethical parameters would not only be maintained, but confirmed in the starkest and probably the most rhetorical of terms. Given the problem of the mutually assured destruction in nuclear war that still haunts the late modern West, it is hard not to share this perspective in the face of the current situation, to which we can now turn very briefly, we're almost done, very briefly, in order to set the terms of the discussion later. So, how should Christians respond to the prospect of World War III? Whether it was Einstein or Oppenheimer or someone else who said it, the fact remains that a war conducted by means of nuclear weapons will render the next World War an engagement with weapons of sticks and stones. Surely there must exist among Western humanity in the current context those who are sitting back in stupefied amazement at the broad support politically, domestically, and ideologically for an ever deeper engagement of the West in a war with Russia in the defense of the Ukraine. Just the very fact that many of us have known 2 generations of soldiers who were themselves combatants in 2 major wars should be enough to give us extreme pause to support any new worldwide engagement in war. I myself knew 2 grandfathers who served in both wars. That we are now considering it just and right to enter into a third world conflict in just over a period of 100 years is seemingly unbelievable to many. Yet that is where we are. Can any of the discussion above on just war help us find a way out of this? It is highly doubtful at this point. I'm being pessimistic for a reason. Yet, we as a people of faith are no less responsible as citizens of our state than our forefathers were in theirs. We too, as Barth so insistently puts it, are belligerents and co-belligerents in the current context. It is we who, by virtue of our cooperation with the state, putting our imprimatur on its current conflict, are also responsible to act as Christian conscience and the ethical norms dictate. None of us are exempt from obedience to the divine command, thou shalt not kill. We cannot be passive or neutral in the face of the current threat to our existence as a human race. We cannot continue to ignore the existential crisis that is staring us in the face as though it does not really exist. We're like deers in the headlights. I know something about that because I do a lot of hunting. We are ourselves, as Christians, called to an ethical response and duty. Not one of us is exempt. Yet to date, I have not read a single article or op-ed, and I know I'm going to end up getting pointed to some, so that'll be a happy circumstance, if I do, that truly takes up the current situation from the Christian ethical point of view of its justness or unjustness. Almost everything I am reading today from a Western perspective is either semi-apologetic or outright apologetic for war. So I have some questions for you. Is the war in the Ukraine justifiable either from the point of view of the defensive or the offensive position. Indeed, are these lines even clear enough and clearly demarcated precisely as to who is the perpetrator and who has to fight of necessity to defend their state? Were we to have leisure to bring the competing narratives to the bar of what we have already said about the justification for war in the conventional sense, would either belligerent have the moral high ground? By the way, I was planning to do that as the third section of this paper, and I decided I have too much material. Would both have grounds? Are we in sufficient possession of the facts such that when we take the Ukrainian case, for example, to the bar of justification, to see if the minimum standards we have established for it are met, can we justify it? Would we agree that were we to take the Russian perspective and bring it to the same bar, that Russia holds the proper case for a just war or not? That there is a wrong they feel only war can justify or rectify? Or is it the case that, in agreement with Karl Barth, we have not held to the pacifist perspective long enough, either on the level of Christian ethical witness or social political attitude and policy that we seem to be taking in respect to this conflict in the West? Have we assumed the posture in the current climate that war is an absolute evil that must not be engaged in except under the most extreme conditions? And as an opus alien, too, an alien work for Christianity. Even if we regard the Russian invasion of the Crimea and the Donbass to be a just cause for war in some sense, is it such an extreme situation that requires the involvement of states that are, for all intents and purposes, technically non-allied states with the Ukraine? There is an informal alliance, but not a formal one that requires the invocation of Article 5 as is required for NATO states. Are we risking a nuclear confrontation that could end in mutually assured destruction, even under the conditions of a just cause for war? Not just in a theological sense, but in a political, philosophical sense as well. Do we have, or do we in the West have, just cause to escalate the conditions of war in the hopes of ejecting Russia out of Ukraine? Or, as we have so often heard, in the hopes of weakening the Russian state to such a degree that she can never wage aggressive war again? We've already seen in Barth and Augustine, and actually Aquinas too, that the weakening of an adversary cannot, in and of itself, amount to a just cause for war. In fact, theologically anyway. In fact, should we not agree with Barth here that the possibility for mutually assured destruction now makes any justification for war untenable from a Christian ethical perspective? Should we not extend this trajectory out even further, given that mutually assured destruction is not just a possibility on the nuclear side, but also other biological, chemical, and technological developments have made it possible in so many other ways that we dare not venture war? Finally, can we say as Christians that we have called on our governments, to whom we have a certain responsibility as Christians, constantly and insistently, to create the necessary diplomatic and social structural realities that make for the institution and maintenance of peace, such that war is unnecessary? One could, I suppose, point to the Constitution of the United States as that means, but the United States as a nation has been transformed since its inception to become the means to establish political hegemony in the name of democracy, rather than as a model nation that fosters an attitude of peace among states. To that degree, it has failed in its current circumstance to live up to both its history and its constitution. Probably going to get in trouble over that. This paper, conclusion here, this paper has not been presented as an academic exercise in theological social ethics for the church-state relations in respect to just war per se. Its intent has been more practically driven by the urgency of the moment. It is clear that in the Christian tradition, some exigencies of the social political existence of the state made a theological justification of war desirable. As a result, most Christian traditions have supported some form of just war theology. But the argument of this paper has been that the new situation in which the possibility for war persists requires a different stance that traditionally proffered by Christianity, let me restate that. The new situation in which the possibility for war persists requires a different stance than that traditionally proffered by Christianity, largely because it was based on a different cultural and technological concept of war. This new situation involves the persistent and ever-expanding options that the state now possesses for mutually assured destruction. Since the classic view has always had some possible preservation and or recovery of the collective good in view, it would seem that such a possibility can now never be assured through the waging of war, however just or necessary it may seem to be. While Barth's position is problematic on many levels, not the least of which is its apparent inconsistency in the rejection of both militarism and absolute pacifism. Nevertheless, his extreme hesitancy to give to Christian ethics the possibility of the justification for the taking of life under any circumstances seems salutary in the light of mutually assured destruction. In fact, I remain convinced that were Barth alive today to see how much the threat has grown, he might have to admit to some form of absolute pacifism. As a person who has traditionally supported my nation as a just participant in many wars, particularly World War I and World War II, I now find myself on the same trajectory because I see no good alternative as an outcome of war. This puts me in a quandary in respect to the suffering of both the Ukrainian and the Russian peoples at this time, to be sure. But I cannot now see how the involvement of the West can alleviate that suffering on either side. It can only increase it and make that suffering and loss of life much more widespread. The situation stands in direct contradiction to the commandment of life, expressed in the Decalogue as, "Thou shalt not kill."
Thank you, Dr. Spencer. Dr. Havers, the floor is yours for your response.
Sorry, no slides. Just my lovely voice. I want to thank my colleague and friend, Professor Archie Spencer, for inviting me as a respondent to this important lecture. As he noted, the Ukraine conflict threatens to spiral out of control and become an even more terrible war. And this has happened before. The catalyst that sparked World War I was a regional conflict. This time the stakes are even higher precisely because we live in the nuclear age. Our capacity for mutual self-destruction, as Professor Spencer has argued, has changed the face of warfare, requiring Christians to consider whether modern warfare can be justified on the basis of Christian ethics. Theologians such as Karl Barth help Christians know where they must stand and quote any Western justification for war against Russia, which now seems to be a real possibility. Now, I come to this dialogue not as a theologian, but as a political philosopher. And as such, my primary interest is in explaining the difference between good political regimes and bad ones. So typically, good and bad correspond with just and unjust. One cannot make a distinction between a just and unjust regime unless one assumes that reason plays a role in helping us understand what justice or injustice is. According to the traditional political philosophy, no regime, if it is rational and just, wills its own demise. As Aquinas puts it, every order of being and every being as well, by its very nature, strives to keep itself in being. So 3 beings in one sentence.
Beautiful, eh?
Yeah. Natural law dictates that human beings and regimes care about their survival. To paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, no state voluntarily wills its own dissolution. In other words, a state that has no interest in its own preservation, including the common good, is neither rational nor just. So what does this have to do with just war? Well, if a regime wants to survive, it must be willing to wage war under certain circumstances. A state that refuses to do so under any circumstance condemns itself to extinction. To recall Aquinas, the right or duty to wage war is an expression of natural law. To deny this would be a misunderstanding of the providence of God, who willed into being political society. God would not will the purpose of such a society and at the same time deny it the means necessary to fulfill this purpose. Now, survival is not the sole basis for waging war. There are other reasons that comprise the theory of just war. However, survival is the basis for all other just war rules. It's also worth noting that only a rational and just regime with a Christian conscience would even take the rules of just war seriously. Tyrannies don't care about just war. I'm pretty sure that Vladimir Putin doesn't lose any sleep over the implications of just war rules. As Professor Spencer noted, Aquinas insisted that a nation must have a just cause, e.g. protecting the innocent, restoring justice, as well as right intentions. These would forbid the intention of greed, cruelty, expansion of empire, and personal vengeance. Justifiable intentions would include the desire to secure peace, punish evildoers, and defend the unitive moral good. Aquinas' distinction between good and bad intentions reflects the bedrock assumption that a regime has the right to preserve itself. A regime that wages war for the sake of vengeance or greed is not only threatening the well-being of its combatants, it is threatening its own survival as well. Vengeance and greed, after all, are vices that corrupt the regime and its citizens. The rule that war must be a last resort, taken after all diplomatic measures have been tried, further suggests that only a rational regime concerned with its survival would not leap into a war unless it had done everything in its power to prevent it. Now, one of the most controversial just war rules is proportionality, or the calculation that the means by which one tries to win a war does not justify the excessive use of force or unnecessary loss of life. In principle, this means that the deliberate targeting of civilians is off limits. Now, this is controversial because most nations have rarely adhered to this rule.
That's right.
The terrible loss of civilian lives in modern wars is a grim testimony to this fact. However, the historical record does not contradict the credibility of the proportionality principle, which rests on the desire for self-preservation. If a regime engages in unnecessary killing, it loses its legitimacy and thus endangers its own survival. Now, of course, I'm talking about a rational regime, not Putin's. Barth, as Professor Spencer shows, was hardly oblivious to this primary concern about the preservation of life. Life, after all, is a gift from God. I quote, "It is God who gives us the command to live by, and he supplies us with the life we live," end of quote. As Christians, we are commanded to love the lives of others in turn, including our enemies. Furthermore, God can cause us to live and die, although we are commanded to live. The obvious political, ethical, and theological question that arises from all this is, are Christians allowed to take life in order to preserve it? Additionally, can we truly love our neighbors and enemies, including their lives, while at the same time killing them? In short, what exactly does God command us to do in the context of war or peace? I must admit to being unclear as to where Barth stands exactly on just war. Barth, quote, is heavily critical of all forms and conditions under which life is taken. The Christian cannot condone self-defense any more than he can capital punishment, suicide, or euthanasia, though in the case of self-defense, there might be some circumstances in which it is justified, end of quote. Well, is self-defense legitimate or not? The just war tradition says it is, provided there really is self-defense, not greed or vengeance. I'm also puzzled by Barth's apparent ambivalence, quote, ethics cannot forbid war, but it cannot really command it either. It can only point to the Creator's command of life, of respect for life, and say imperturbably, and say again, that in peace and war we humans are measured by this command. Still, quote, Barth sees the concept of just war as theologically indefensible in the light of the command to life, end of quote, even though he does not disavow or disallow just war in a general sense. Now, I sense that Barth, like many Christians, struggles with the apparent contradiction between the God-given command to love our enemies and the necessity of war. For this reason, he takes pacifism very seriously, albeit with some reservations. Pacifists, of course, place peace above all other goods. I cannot overstate that enough, including the survival of a regime or civilization. In fact, peace is the absolute that forbids any form of violence, including self-defense. That includes calling the police, by the way. If you're a consistent pacifist, you will not call the police in the event of an attack on your family or home. I know somebody who is 100% pacifist. I respect his consistency. Anyway, neither militarism nor pacifism is an untenable basis for understanding war, because, quote, modern warfare vitiates these extremes, even though pacifism should be the Christian's first impulse. Still, the decision to go to war may be necessary at the end of the day. So that's my brief exegesis of Barth. Right. I have two responses to this qualified defense of pacifism. First, the just war tradition would agree with Barth that nations must not leap into war until the possibility of securing peace has been exhausted. This is the last resort principle, as mentioned. Anyone who defends just war properly prefers peace to war, depending on the circumstances. This defender would accordingly agree with Barth that war must be undertaken only in a true emergency. Second, Christians who adhere to the just war tradition do so precisely because they value what Barth calls, quote, the restoration of an order of life which is meaningful and just. There is no necessary contradiction between just war and Christian morality if we reflect carefully upon the command to love, which is really the chestnut here. Protecting human lives that tyrannies threaten is a legitimate and rational reason for going to war, one that reflects the desire for self-preservation as well as the preservation of innocent lives. It is also consistent with Christian morality, I say with fear and trembling. Turning the other cheek does not sanction indifference to the preservation of life, nor does it counsel non-resistance to an aggressor. And here I'm leaning heavily on the Christian philosopher Wilmore Kendall, who wrote a very important critique of pacifism in the 1960s. So I quote from Kendall, "Who, asked Thomas Aquinas, has the right to turn the other cheek? Not, mind you, the duty, but the right. Since unless we have the right, we clearly cannot have the duty. Who has the right to submit to unjust aggression? Aquinas answers, only the man upon whom no higher responsibility falls. Only the man who owes no other duty in justice or in charity to a friend or a wife or a child that would be adversely affected by the aggression." End of quote. So, does even an isolated person have this right? Kendall says, yes, but not always, not in all circumstances. Such a man has the right to turn the other cheek only if his act of submitting to the aggressor will or possibly could deter the aggressor from his evil act. Because, of course, pacifism believes that there's always a conscience that one can reach through pacifist action. Yeah. Sometimes that's true, not always. If one can alter the conscience of the aggressor through peaceful means, then I quote from Kendall again, then and only then, says Aquinas, ought the Christians to refrain from resistance. If non-resistance clearly cannot effect this end, as who but the pacifist supposes it could against a Hitler or against the disciplined hordes of world communism, this is 1960s, then resistance becomes a duty. End of quote. This is an act of love, not just a matter of saving oneself. So one more quote from Kendall. Resistance would be demanded by the law of Christian love itself. In a word, I ought to be concerned enough about the moral and spiritual health of my enemy to fight him for his own good. When resistance to aggression is the only means whereby I can cure a man of evil, then the love I owe him demands that I resist him. You don't hear that argument very often. End of quote. So what does this have to do with applying just war rules in a nuclear war? Is it true that, quote, from Professor Spencer, the slippery slope to the use of nuclear weapons makes the justification of war virtually impossible? Is the argument for just war wholly unsatisfactory in this perilous age? These are legitimate questions. It is also valid to ask whether Western intervention on behalf of the Ukraine is just or reasonable. I believe that the just war tradition still offers answers to these questions which demonstrate the relevance of this tradition. So I'm finishing up here. I agree that there are dangers and risks embedded in Western support for Ukraine's self-defense. The risk of escalation is a real one, as is the possibility of nuclear conflict. These risks require rational and moral justification. Recalling the argument of Wilmore Kendall, is there any reason to believe that non-resistance to Putin's aggression will deter future aggression from his regime? I think we know the answer to that. Non-resistance or turning the other cheek would be interpreted as an act of weakness by a regime that respects only force. Putin has even indicated that he has designs on the rest of the Baltic states, musing about the restoration of the old Russian or Soviet Empire. Can these threats be dismissed as just empty talk? This attitude is laden with risk as well. Reliance on diplomatic means is certainly admirable if there were any possibility of a negotiated peace that would last. At present, however, both Russia and the Ukraine have invested so much blood and treasure in this war that such a peace is elusive. Besides, to paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, one can teach the lion to lie down with the lamb, even though the lion does not thereby become lamb-like in the process. I had to get that in. So. In conclusion, non-resistance to Russia, well, not quite conclusion, non-resistance to Russia carries another risk, one that may trigger a nuclear war. China, at least China's regime, is carefully watching this conflict, while it ponders a similar invasion of one of its neighbors, namely Taiwan. If the Chinese Communist Party detected any weakness on the part of the West's resolve to stand up for the Ukraine, another war that is even more destructive may be around the corner. In short, the survival of global peace is arguably, I emphasize that adverb, arguably, at stake in this terrible war. So, in fine, there is always uncertainty in the application of force to end conflicts. This is known as the fog of war. Although just war rules provide some necessary clarity, all the rationality and morality in the world will not clear up this fog. At best, Christians are obligated to apply these rules as well as they can do so, knowing full well that the other side will be indifferent to these rules. Thank you.
As I thought you would be, incisive and very, very astute. I think at the end of the day, we both agree that, you know, in extreme situations, for the survival of a state, there has to be the option for war. Whether and I like Bart's distinction between it being an alien work, therefore outside the parameters of the normal understanding of the state's role in creation that God created for it, as opposed to its proper work. So I like that language. That helps me understand that even more so it should be the absolute last resort. And then I like that idea of the last resort. So I think on the substance of whether or not, you know, war is sometimes, in extreme cases, justified, I think we both agree. I do want to make clear that this paper was oriented not as something instructive for the social, political, geopolitical situation, or, you know, for Putin or Zelensky, which both of which I agree are quite unconcerned about theological justification for war at this point. Rather, my goal, as it was Bart's goal, is to caution the church and to ask questions about what our ethical command is, and to therefore take a position in pacifism to the utter end of that argument in this situation. Because everything you said, you know, about the exigencies of the state needing and the fog of war is all well and true. Were we in a different era, I would agree even more. But it's not clear to anybody what the motivations are, even from the point of view of Western democracies anymore. And that's my point. I think Western democracies have lost their way and have lost the right at this point to interject in the Ukraine. And that's what worries me. Because we have actors involved in the process who have a decided interest. You know, I mean, again, keeping in mind that my paper was directed towards calling the church's conscience to account. Nevertheless, I don't see how the old Soviet regime could ever be reestablished in our lifetime on the basis of the current situation, economically, socially, politically, in Russia. So I am, in fact, worried that that is a canard, a red herring, something used to convince us of the need for Western interjection in the war. And I'm concerned about that. I'd like to see, logically, it makes sense. Logically, you laid it out. I think the way you put it is very hard to refute. On the other hand, looking at the primary actors, particularly, a certain group that exists at the center of the foreign policy making decisions in the White House, it gives me great cause for concern. So on that, we'll have to agree to disagree, I think. But by and large, that is an absolutely splendid response to this paper, and I thank you very much for it. So hopefully you'll let me publish that alongside this particular piece as a response. All right, questions, comments?
Yeah, we have lots of time for questions, so please, online folks, share your questions in the chat, and anybody here, if you have a question, just raise your hand, I'll call on you and deliver your question. We'd love to hear from you.
Dr. Havers, you mentioned that choosing to not respond to Putin, we all sort of know how that would go, and I'll kind of agree on that's not going to have any effect on him. But I wonder if you can speak at all to the idea, or there's the stories and reports that we've heard that the people of Russia oppose the war, that there are people within Russia, within the state, the aggressor state, and in China as well, that there are people there who disagree with that war. Can a leader of a state force people who don't want to go? What happens if they just say, like, we'd rather go to jail than go to war, and refuse to fight?
I'm not privy. I guess none of us is privy to what is actually happening in Russia. I mean, aside from news reports here and there, but I think it's a safe bet that opposition to Putin in Russia has not become so successful or so intense that it threatens his regime. There were people at the beginning of the war who thought that Putin's regime would crack. They didn't anticipate China's support or India's support. Consider that. India is the largest democracy in the world. It's backing up Russia. It's buying lots of goods and resources from Russia. So much for the war for democracy here. Israel is also contributing to Russia, or at least I should say not going along with the sanction regime. I even read recently that Russia's economy might grow faster than the U.S. economy. Now, where did I read that? It might have been in The Economist. I was stunned by that.
Yeah, me too.
So Russia is actually doing well in an economic and political sense. As far as I can tell, Putin has enough popular support to perpetuate the war, which is very depressing. I was hoping and praying that he would be taken away through an act of God at some point, but it hasn't happened yet. So
it's probably not as high as the Russian media reports it at, which is somewhere around 80 to 90% or something like that. But it's in the 60s and 70s almost for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
By the way, one of those articles you referred to about the economy of Russia growing was in Bloomberg.
Oh, okay.
So, if you can't trust Bloomberg, who can you trust?
How come we don't hear anything about the church in terms of any political diplomacy that's going on?
I'll tell you why. I think there was a time when the church's voice, especially in its mainline denominations, Catholicism, Anglicanism, and certain aspects of mainline Protestantism in Europe, were respected. Particularly, the agency of the World Council of Churches not only carried considerable clout in terms of religious influence in the Western nations, it was also regarded as sort of The alternative to the political statements of the Vatican, it was the political statements of the Protestant faith that had some pull among politicians and Western democracies. But with the increasing secularization of Western democracies and the increasing move of those democracies away from any form of reference to their Judeo-Christian basis, and for that matter, the foundation of their legislation and ethical laws, there has come a concomitant unwillingness of the state to hear anything that the church has to say on this. When you combine that with the advancement of forms of secularism within the church itself and the dilution of its fundamental message, its fundamental orientation in, let's say, Christian orthodoxy in the broad sense of the term, well, those two factors alone lead to a weakening of the church in terms of its capacity to speak in any substantial way to issues of life that matter in our time. This is true not just about the case of just war, it's also true of the case of euthanasia, it's true of the case of abortion. We're just now recently debating MAID here in Canada, and it has, through the back door, been now made available to those who are mentally ill. Right? So, I remember the great hue and cry of the West when National Socialism introduced this very same idea into its regime, and everybody was agog over it at that time. Matter of fact, I just finished watching a series that's based on that premise. But today, we don't even hear a whimper from the church. Back then, the church was front and center. And where they had to, they made their statements in a powerful way. Like, for instance, in response to the Nuremberg laws. The Barmen Declaration was developed. Again, this was a document that was developed by Barth and two other theologians who went to a hotel, drank a bunch of wine, had a few cigars. The other two fell asleep, and Barth wrote the Declaration. That is a true story. That was true.
More
that
Calvinist
happened.
than Lutheran because of that.
But the Barmen Declaration, even though it didn't overwhelm the National Socialist state, it formed a very essential drag, or I should say, restriction on the consciousness of the German church that was up to that point ready and willing to support the German state in every way. So it has to do with the loss of hegemony in the West of the church. That's why there's no effective voice. So that's why I'm saying tonight, to the church at least, we need to find within ourselves the ethical voice that we need.
Do you think it'd make a difference?
Well, it has to make a difference in the church before it makes a difference in the culture. And my worry is it going to make a difference in the church? That's the battle that I'm fighting. Right? Then once we've got a consciousness of that, we can maybe see what our voice will be in the broader culture. But I have no expectations of it.
If I may ask, is it a loss of hegemony or is it a loss of hope? Because we can't underestimate, and this is brought up about, with World War I, yes, it was a regional conflict that ostensibly caused the conflict, but it was actually the imperatives of industrialists that were behind World War I. And if you sync that up with what we're talking about in terms of how it's sort of injecting steroids into the economy, we also then start to get a picture of a nation state that, contrary to this idea of it being secular, actually worships Mammon and Mars. Mm-hmm. And how do we view the command to love upon which all the law and prophets hang? Not just the laws, but the prophets.
You mean prophets?
Proclamations of
P-H-E-T-S or
prophets.
F-I-T-S?
No, the prophets, in contradistinction to the prophets.
Yeah.
How do we view it not just as laws, but as promises?
Mm-hmm.
And promises that we can hang our hope on up to the last minute and last resort and beyond. And until we can have that sort of prophetic resistance to a nation state and a church that thinks it worships God often, but really just worships the state, that we can't offer a compelling witness to a world.
That's right. I would say that's the third part of my answer to his question as well, which I think is directly related.
Great.
And that is that not just secularism, but consumerism, which has made its way as a late modern child of, secularism. I mean, there was the centered self in theology, then there was the rational self in the cogito, then there was the decentered self in existentialism, and now there's the consumptive self in the late modern period. And I think the consumptive self, churches are populated with the consumptive self. And it's our capacity for that consumption that distracts us to the degree that we can't form any unified thinking about matters political that are important. And that's a very real problem. So yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a sort of a hopelessness that's attendant to that because it's nihilistic. It's late existential. And that's part of the problem.
I was going to say, we have heard from one church, the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes, we have.
Which is practically the theological arm of the Putin regime, but they're all for the anti-Nazi war in the Ukraine, and I think they have probably convinced many Russians that the Nazis are back. It doesn't help that German tanks are back in the Ukraine.
Or that they paint crosses on them.
The kind of symbolism there. I'd also like to add, though, regarding what Christians can do, I guess I'm a little puzzled, too, by the relative silence, because Christian anti-war movements in the past, including pacifist ones, have been successful. I mean, it's worth noting that one of the most successful pacifist and anti-war movements in history was the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, which obviously included Dr. Martin Luther King, but many others. But it's also worth noting on top of that as terrible as the enemy that Dr. King and his movement were facing, namely the segregationist South and all its violence, was a terrible enemy. That movement was able to draw on the moral support of American public opinion, which goes back to a question that was just asked, can Putin's regime be toppled? There's no evidence that a pacifist movement or an anti-war movement has ever toppled a dictatorship. There was a pacifist movement in Nazi Germany. It didn't last long, but it was the White Rose movement that emerged in Munich after the defeat at Stalingrad.
That's right, yeah.
And I think we know, or we can guess what happened to it. They were handing out leaflets, anti-Nazi leaflets on the University of Munich campus. So they were quickly locked up, and they were executed. And according to Hitler's table talk, he laughed about this.
Yeah.
So the pacifists were crushed.
Yeah.
And I think that's what would happen if it's not already happened in Putin's Russia.
And I should say, it's a good comment, because that's part of the reason why Bart could not take an absolute pacifist position. Because in the culture in which he was not only raised, but in which he had to live and work, under the conditions of 2 world wars, that would have been very quickly squelched, and he would have had no voice. And yet, what position could he take? He couldn't take the militarist position. So he had to find himself somewhere in the middle, and he had to find a cause for Christian ethics that related to the issue of war, but did not justify it. And so his cause was the work of peace. I hope he caught that. That was the middle position, was that in matters of war, what Christianity has to work for, first and foremost, is a lasting and stable peace. Well, the end of that argument could well be that war is one of the means to that stable peace, but not until the possible conditions for that peace and its longevity are established as a task of the church, ethically speaking.
So we have an online question here.
Yeah.
This is from Ryan. Is it really fair to say that Putin has no interest in the Christian just war tradition? He certainly has embraced the Russian Orthodox Church as foundational for the Russian state of society, as you were pointing out. But could you speak to the just war tradition in the Eastern Church tradition rather than the Western Church tradition? Either of you.
Well, I think you just did that, but...
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on the Russian Orthodox Church. I would have thought, though, that there aren't many pacifists in that church right now.
There was one.
Okay. But I see the Russian Orthodox Church as just a theological arm of Putin's regime, and that doesn't mean that Putin has any kind of Christian faith. I think for him, religion is something that's useful to him, politically speaking. It's good for social control. I think Putin has a Machiavellian view of religion. If it keeps the peasants in line, so to speak, then it's useful. And so far, the Orthodox Church has been more than willing to do that.
There are two names that come to mind, Ryan, in this respect. The first is Berdayev. I think his first name was Nikolai Berdayev. I can't remember his first name exactly. He was a famous Russian theologian who actually eventually was ejected out of the communist regime, who, if I remember correctly, was indeed a pacifist. And then there was the populist literary theologian of Russia who wrote probably the most stunning work on war ever written, War and Peace, and that's Tolstoy. And the spiritual community that Tolstoy formed was pacifistic. So, it's kind of, there are precedents in the Russian. I'm not sure where Dostoevsky would fit in the discussion. But as an official stance in the Russian Orthodox Church, from everything I've read, most of my understanding of Russian Orthodoxy comes from my reading of Bulgakov, who is just a very fine Russian theologian. And I would say that generally speaking, there's always been a case for just war. They follow Augustine, actually, in their understanding of just war. So the Orthodox Church is always going to support the state. And because there is such a close relationship in the history of Russia between the church and the state. I mean, it was the past emperor, I forget the name, or the czar. Was it Peter? It was earlier than that. It was before Ivan the Terrible, where the emperor converts to Christianity, and this is where Russian Orthodoxy gets its origins, and he then turns around and makes the whole Russian nation convert to Christianity. And out of that political ecclesial root, it emerges. So the question is a good one, because I do think that a reassessment of the re-emerging religious consciousness of Russia is necessary in this conversation as well. And it's too easy to rush to judgment on one side. Putin is an Orthodox Christian, and therefore, he has a particular theological justification for this. Or on the other hand, Putin's not really interested in the church. He just wants to keep them quiet or supportive and gives them churches in the process. Both of which extremes I've read. Somewhere in the middle is the emergence of the new religious consciousness of Russia. And so for me, this is not about Putin. It's about, other than 75 years of history, a people who bring to humanity a deposit that is substantial. We can sit here and list the music achievements, the literary achievements, the theological achievements, if we want. So in all of this, I'm just simply saying the Ukrainian people and the Russian people somehow need to be preserved. And but in the current context, one wonders, which one will be obliterated first. And it will be a loss on either side for humanity.
There also are pre-Augustine resources.
Yes.
Right? I mean, some of the earliest documents, right?
Ambrose.
Can a Christian be a soldier?
Yeah.
Pre-Constantine, pre-Christendom.
Ambrose wrote a piece too, I
Yeah.
think.
So
And
as
Athanasius.
adjacent to the resurrection as you can get without being a writer of scripture in the canon, they're working out that question in a non-quote-unquote Christian world and saying, probably not.
Yeah, everything I read generally tended to suggest that up to Augustine, generally speaking, the church was pacifist. It was a default position, but it wasn't worked out per se. So, yes.
So in terms of involvement, so like being involved in war do we consider opening our borders to Ukrainian refugees' involvement? Because I see that as maybe possibly being an out of we're not sending anything, we're not sending troops, we're not sending money, but we are allowing them to escape possibly a destructive environment.
Well, there were early voices calling for humanitarian aid. And I think that that's where, indeed, as a nation, we should put our resources, right? And I would say, if you could convince me and others in the rest of the West that indeed there is such an injustice going on here that absolutely we have no choice but to defend the Ukraine through war, then I would have to default to that latent position in just war and say yes. But that's my issue. I can't be clear about that, and I don't think the church has thought about it enough to be clear themselves. For that matter, I don't think politicians have thought about it enough to be clear themselves. Most of them seem to be reacting or acting off the cuff, or at least that's what I see, right? But I don't know. I think that humanitarian aid is what should be extended in every form we possibly can. So, good comment. Question.
Go ahead.
So yeah, my English is not as good as yours, so.
That's okay.
I like to.
That's okay, Mike. What's your original language?
Sorry?
What's your original language?
Korean.
Well, my Korean's catastrophic, so.
My English is better than your Korean. Okay?
There you go.
Probably outside of topic a little bit, but as an engineer, and I see the huge transformation of technologies
Yes.
from human to like AI or robotic.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of your idea or your session tonight was actually talking about the loss of life. But what if the aspect of future warfare is nothing to do with taking lives, but it's more about robotic war or the AI war, etc., etc. Will that change your viewpoint about just war? And do you think theological justification for those kind of warfare can be possible?
There was a time when I told you that question is so far out that it's virtually impossible to answer. But in fact now, with unmanned UAVs and so on, more and more robotic warfare seems to be a possibility. But then there's the question of destruction and issues with property, because none of this is going to be friendly at the end of the day. It's not like you can get a little ring together and get seats in and go, okay, let's have robot wars. But they actually did that for a while. I watched a few of them. But I would say, if technologically those kinds of advancements did come along, and observationally, and in terms of reading and understanding, I was able to make a determination about their relative innocuousness in regard to the command for life, then I would say that that's a different set of rules than nuclear arms. But as long as nuclear arms exists, no amount of robotic or indirect warfare not involving humanity will ever suffice. So I think until we denuclearize our states, we are stuck in a conundrum as to what we need to do or what we can do in the event of war. I'm less confident than others that, because I've followed this war very closely. I've watched where it started and where it's at now, and the kinds of escalations have taken place, and we've got escalations coming around the corner. We've got eventually Leopard's going to be introduced to the field. There's going to be eventually Abrams. If Abrams get on the field, I can guarantee you now that's going to be a red line. And then what happens? Where do we stop the escalation? That's my concern. Yes, fog of war, but at some point the fog of war becomes, explosive, and that's my major concern.
I hate to take an unpopular position here, but philosophers like to do that. But Professor Spencer mentioned MAD quite a bit, especially in the context of the Cold War. Well, I know hindsight is 20/20 vision, but nuclear weapons, in a sense, kept the peace during the Cold War.
That's true.
That's not
There's
a
an argument
popular
for
thing
that.
to say. I'm pretty sure, again, fog of war, that
Yeah.
the United States and the Soviet Union would have gone to war many times during the Cold War had it not been for MAD. And of course, MAD presupposes a Hobbesian psychology, or the rationality that you need to fear your own death. Or as Sting said, I hope the Russians love their children too, or
Yes.
some argument like that. Whether we're dealing with rational actors in the Kremlin right now is hard to say. I mean, I think there is obviously genuine fear that Iran will acquire very soon nuclear weapons. I think that's a real game changer because I'm far from convinced that the mullahs are rational. I would say Putin has some rationality. I mean, let's hope so. But as for the mullahs, I doubt that. And I think, of course, that requires a rethinking of MAD as well.
If I can go back to the question about technology, having studied an inordinate amount of the innovations in war technologies and the creative ways we've come up with killing people indirectly, we're far farther away from that type of innocuous warfare. The mystique of unmanned aircraft dropping precision missiles onto singular targets is just that, a mystique. The amount of civilian casualties that are caused by the actual type of missiles and bombs that are dropped on targets is actually really disturbing and reprehensible. Cluster bombs are like mines on steroids, and they're dropped indiscriminately against a target, and the amount of civilians that are killed in the radius are astronomical. Likewise with precision-guided missiles, they're actually not incredibly precision. And likewise, even if we can imagine a world in which we are manning war technologies by distance, I wonder what type of nihilistic world that would produce.
Yeah.
If you look at the post-traumatic stress that is caused by the operators of these drones, it's awful. And so again, what word of hope do we have to offer a world that is working its way towards that type of killing and murder? Probably have time for one more question to close it out.
I'd like to come back to one more comment that Grant made about Putin and his rationality. Knock on wood. I hear this question being asked a lot, but nobody is, in a popular way or in the press, asking this question about the State Department in the United States or about the President of the United States, who can't even string two sentences together coherently. No, nobody's asking about whether or not the rational imbalance that you spoke about in terms of the survival of the state is not existent on both sides of the equation. That's my worry. That's my worry. I think in the normal conduct of the state would find ways to make it clear that it is in possession of the rational stand in relation to war. That certainly would have happened under Eisenhower in the United States during World War II. It certainly happened, under Roosevelt and others. So I say yes, let's talk about the irrationality of Putin, but let's not forget about the potential irrationality that exists in the Western, and one could then go from America to France to Britain and ask equal, and then to Germany. I don't know, did you all of you see the piece that the German Die Welt did on with a picture of, of Biden with the sunglasses holding the hand of Olaf Scholz, like he was a child. Like, it seems to me that there is indeed a breach in the normal rational capacities of the nation state to hold its place in a proper way. So I don't know, Grant, do you have any comment about that?
I think that issue has come up sometimes. I mean, NATO's refusal to create a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, I think is an act of rationality. Because
Yes.
if NATO sent in its air force in whole or in part and then started shooting down Russian planes, that would be World War III.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad that they haven't done that yet. But at the same time, it is important to look at the historical context leading up to this conflict. We were talking
Yes,
about this,
yes.
but one reason that there is this conflict is because NATO expanded its borders well beyond Western Europe into the east, into former Soviet states, after President Bush the Elder, sounds like the Roman Empire, promised not to do that, but it was a verbal promise. But
Yes.
apparently President Poppy Bush promised the Russians they wouldn't expand NATO. And then, of course, the United States violated that promise, beginning with Clinton soon
Yes.
after that. And the Russians, unlike North Americans, the Russians have an historical memory. They remember everything. North America, I'm sorry to generalize, but the historical memory of North Americans is, how shall I put this, limited, to say the least. And that's,
Yeah.
and
It's the length.
that's dangerous.
It's the length of one Twinkie.
But if you throw in the amount of proxy wars that the states and other allies have been waging since the War on Terror, that often eludes the mainstream discourse on things. We have one more question. I think it's great to close it out.
Okay.
To Dr. Spencer, I appreciate the clarity around the paper being focused on cautioning the church. How could your conclusion surface in a local church context? What would you hope for? Is it simply a matter of the leaders making statements?
Well, from a practical point of view, I am honing this into a very practical piece that I'm hoping to present at my own local church. And I'm hoping to make it available for others, because I think part of the problem is nobody's talking about it and nobody wants to talk about it because they don't have the categories. So that's one practical answer to the question. What else could be done is, I'm not exactly sure. The church is so impotent on so many levels that it takes our leadership and pastors and those in the upper echelons of denominational leadership to begin to take this seriously as a concern that we should be talking about. Are we ready in the event of a worldwide war? And we do have multiple refugees landing on our shores. Were churches adapted to be the humanitarian solution in that circumstance? That would be one of the things that we could do, right? But we're not even talking about that. We're not even thinking about it. And that's what concerns me. So, who asked that question?
Somebody by the name of Jesse.
Jesse, thank you. Is that Jesse Schellenberg?
No, Jesse Wilson.
Jesse Wilson.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jesse.
Well, please join me in giving a round of applause to our presenters.
Thank you, brother.
And thank you, everyone, in person and online, for attending. Stay posted for the next In the Chair Symposium. There will be more.
There's one coming in the fall, but he's going to be in charge, so he has to get his act together pretty soon.
So stay tuned for that.
Pressure.